Good evening, and welcome to our panel on the Italian presidential elections. My name is Eric Jones, and I'm director of the Robert Schuman Center. Robert Schuman Center of the European University Institute is very happy to host this as part of our larger strategic ambition to bring the study and discussion of Italian politics more fully into the research and policy-related work that we do. We're not alone in this ambition. There are other institutions that have made this possible. The Conference Group on Italian Politics and Society of the American Political Science Association, the Società Italiana di Scienza Politica, the Loop, which is the official blog of the European Consortium for Political Research, and indeed the Financial Times, which gave us permission to bring Sylvia into our community. I want to thank all of those organizations for helping us to run this event. And with no further ado, I'd like to hand over to Martin Bull, who will be the master of ceremonies for our proceedings. Martin, over to you.
Thank you very much, Eric. Good evening, everybody, and welcome to the roundtable on the 2022 Italian presidential elections. My name is Martin Bull. I'm Professor of Politics at the University of Salford. I'm currently President of Congrips and founding editor of The Loop. This evening, we have 5 experts to talk about the outcome of the Italian presidential election. We have Bill Emmett, former editor-in-chief of Economist, Professor Selena Grinaldi from the University of Padova, Professor Gianfranco Pasquino from the University of Bologna, Professor Simona Piattoni from the University of Trento, and Silvia Sciorelli Borelli, Milan correspondent for the Financial Times. We are going to ask each of our panelists longer than 5 minutes, highlighting what they think is the significance of the election for a second term of office of Sergio Mattarella, and how they see this election as shaping developments in the period between now and the national elections that must happen by June 2023. And after that, we'll be taking questions and comments from the floor through the chat, and these will be moderated by Eric, and we will then put them. Before that, I want to spend about 1 minute for those members of the audience who may have joined us today and really not understood a lot of what's been going on. I want to spend 1 minute summarizing the basic facts. I'm going to try to stick to facts. The Italian presidential election is held every 7 years to elect the president, who is the head of state. The president is the guarantor of national unity and has several important powers, especially in relation to the formation of governments and the population. The role, therefore, is more than just a figurehead. The Electoral College consists of 1,009 parliamentarians and regional delegates. Voting takes place each day until an outcome is secured, usually 1 ballot a day, unless there are requests to move to 2 ballots a day. To get elected, a candidate requires on the first 3 ballots a 2/3 majority, and from the 4th ballot onwards, an absolute majority, meaning 505 votes. Now, the election of the 13th president since the founding of the Italian Constitution in 1948 began on the 24th of January and finished on the 29th of January, with the 8th ballot delivering the election of Sergio Mattarella, the incumbent, for the term of office, which will begin on Wednesday. Mattarella received a total of 759 votes against the next candidate, Carlo Nordio, who got 90 votes. So it is a very clear majority. It is very unusual, but not unprecedented, for a president to serve for a second term. When President Giorgio Napolitano was elected for a second term. However, he stood down 1 year and 244 days into his second term, as he had always indicated that he would be unlikely to serve a full term. On this occasion, Mattarella had made it expressly clear that he did not want to serve for a second term. He had, in his own words, other plans. But he changed his mind when it was clear after 7 ballots that no other candidate was likely to obtain the required seat. Now over to our speakers. And I'm going to start by turning to Gianfranco Pasquino. Gianfranco, over to you.
Thank you, Martin. Thank you for inviting me. I'm going to start by saying that there are 2 losers in the Italian presidential elections. One is Mario Draghi and the other one is Sergio Mattarella. Mario Draghi wanted to become President of the Republic and he didn't make it. So he decided to transform himself into a kingmaker. He went to the outgoing President of the Republic, Sergio Mattarella, and he begged him to stay on. Sergio Mattarella has said, as you, Martin, hinted at, that he was not going to stay because he had other plans. He motivated his willingness to retire with 2 reasons. Personal motivations, personal reasons. He was tired. He said that 14 times, and also for institutional reasons. That is, we should not create a precedent of re-election of the Italian President of the Republic, even though the precedent already existed, because Giorgio Napolitano was obliged to stay, was asked to stay by the parliamentarians in 2015. So the president already existed. By the way, there is nothing in the Constitution saying that the president cannot be re-elected, but it does not mean that what is not said is not wished for. I would say that the constitution makers did not want the president to be re-elected. The spirit of that article is that we will allow some flexibility, but we would not in a way hope for the re-election of a president. Why Draghi and Mattarella are losers? Because Draghi wanted to become president and Mattarella did not want to return to the presidency, but also because now their task will be much more difficult. They have provided what the Italian political system needs, some amount of political stability and governmental stability. This is what apparently all European authorities wanted, because they are rightly afraid of Italian political instability. But it is not true that this can be taken for granted. Indeed, there will be very many tensions and very many conflicts in the government led by Draghi, and there will be very many tensions and conflicts between Parliament and the President of the Republic. And now they are obliged to perform even better than what they have done between February 2021 and now. This is a real challenge for both. It is true, of course, that we need Draghi in order to implement the EU next generation EU plan, that we need Mattarella because the image he projects, not only to the foreigners, but especially to the Italians, is of a serious, credible, reliable man capable of projecting the image of a decent Italy, something that is always very important. But this is not enough. That is, what is necessary is to have a real convergence of views among the governmental partners. And this is not the product of the presidential elections. Some tensions will continue, some ambitions will probably try to find an outlet in the various governmental activities, and I'm not going to bet on the stability from now until March 2023. Indeed, it will be a sort of turbulent period. Let me add one point, because I think it is very important, that you cannot have a political system to be considered stable when you need just 2 men and those 2 men. That is, we have been accustomed to know that Mussolini was the man of the Providence, according to what a very famous cardinal said when the Concordat was signed. Now we do not need 2 men of the Providence, 2 uomini della provvidenza. First of all, we may have some reservations about having only uomini being blessed by the Providenza. Maybe time to have some women of the Providenza. Second, if you want a viable political system, there should be very many protagonists. And indeed, the protagonists existed. They were not allowed to be chosen. They were not allowed to be seen by the foresightedness, if I can put it this way, of the various party leaders. Those who wanted to win big, such as Salvini, and those who were unable even to bet, such as Letta and to a large extent Conte. So this situation is not a sort of a very good situation. Indeed, the losers will have to fight their way if they want to make an imprint on Italian politics and to change Italian politics for the better. So far, I don't see any change, any positive change in the meeting, in the leading. Okay, thank you.
Thank you very much indeed.
In the making, I wanted to say in the making.
In the making, got it. Thank you very much, Gianfranco, for starting us off. I'm now going to turn to Selena Grimaldi. Thank you.
Okay, thank you for inviting me, first of all. At first sight, nothing really changed. We have the same president, we have the same prime minister, the same cabinet, and the same fragile ruling coalition that we had at the very beginning. So this is the situation, but actually something had changed, and especially the situation within parties is changed. We thought that this sort of tripolarism was behind us, but actually we have no bipolarism at the moment, because on the one side we have the parties of the center right, but this coalition basically splits apart during this presidential election. And on the other side, I don't know if the coalition between the Democratic Party and the Five Star Movement can be maintained in future. So this is the situation. I think that this presidential election had an impact on party system. On the one hand, probably Salvini is no longer the leader of the center right, both because his party is losing votes against Brother of Italy, and secondly, because he demonstrates his poor bargaining capacity. And in multi-party systems and coalition government situation, you need this kind of skills, bargaining capacities. In fact, he basically faced each single possible move in this presidential election. He couldn't oppose Berlusconi's self-nominee. He couldn't oppose Casellati's nominee, despite it was clear she has no chances to be elected. And finally, he burned probably Belloni's nominee, since he was too anxious to show his role as kingmaker of this election. And so I think he is the loser of this election. But of course, another loser is the Democratic Party, because it is true that they obtained their second best option, that is Mattarella, but not the first one, that was Draghi, as Pasquino emphasized it. And then another point is that the Five Star Movement shows its lacking organization, no clear leadership, and I think it would be a problem in the near future to maintain this coalition between the Democratic Party and the Five Star Movement. Finally, from this situation, probably Draghi seems to be reinforced in a way, because all parties lose in a way, but he was able to maintain his position as prime minister. But I think that, I don't know, he needs the parliamentary majority, he needs supports in parliament to implement the reforms that we need, and also he needs their support to obtain the European money, and also he needs their support to manage the pandemic. So the question is for how long? I don't know. I think that in the near future, Draghi will have a lot of problems in managing this ruling coalition that is more divided than it used to be. And finally, I would underline only another point, that differently to what occurred with Napolitano's second election, the option of a Mattarella bis has always been on the table. It was a specific strategy of the leader of the Democratic Party. And I don't know, probably this is also a chance for Draghi in a way in the future to be a re-elected president if Mattarella will serve only for a couple of years. So we will see. But this potential outcome will depend on his ability now to achieve certain important goals. And I don't know, it will be hard, I think, for him and for this ruling coalition.
Thank you very much indeed, Selena. So far we've had two speakers and we've got Draghi, loser, Mattarella, loser, Salvini, loser, Democratic Party, loser, Five-Star Movement, loser. This is turning into one of those elections where there isn't a winner. Bill, help us out. Over to you, Bill Emmett.
Well, thank you, Martin, and I'm delighted to be here too. It's funny, I was just writing down on my notepad here, winners, question mark, because there must be some. So let me take that challenge. I think that if we look at this outcome, probably I can say there are three winners. Winner number one is, perhaps we could call it the European Commission and to some degree international markets, who are now assured that as head of state, as president of the Republic, they can expect that for the lifetime of the Piano Nazionale di Ripresa e Resilienza, the EU funds, there is, if you like, a mature, neutral, stabilizing figure in the Quirinale. They had hoped perhaps that might be Mario Draghi, but Sergio Mattarella is a pretty good substitute if he stays for the full 7 years, which takes him beyond not just the lifetime of the PNRR, but also potentially 2 general elections. So that's actually a pretty good outcome from an outsider's point of view. I would say a second winner, and I'm going to disagree a little with Selena, a second winner here is probably Enrico Letta and the Partito Democratico. Why? He didn't get the outcome he wanted, but what he does likely have is 1 more year in which to try to rebuild and extend the PD. He has 1 more year to try to steal the voters of the Cinque Stelle and win back the left. But also what emerged from this election was, as you said, Selena, that the center-right are actually much more divided than they have often looked. There's bitterness between Berlusconi and Salvini and Meloni because they didn't really support his candidacy. Salvini and Meloni are bitter to Berlusconi because he basically spoiled the whole process ahead of the presidential election. Meloni dislikes Salvini, well, we knew that anyway, but also Salvini conducted himself in a very individualistic and selfish way, especially in the last part of the time. So from Enrico Letta's point of view, you could say, well, unlike what the opinion polls have been telling us for the last 2 years or so, that the center-right is very, very likely to win an absolute majority in the next election, whenever it happens, and that they are also much better at forming a coalition than the left, this has been put into at least question. So there's something to play for as far as the PD is concerned, which could include forming a coalition, a majority after an election, at least with the center and even certain Mr. Silvio Berlusconi, who now wants to find new ways to be a kingmaker. So I'm trying to look on the bright side for Enrico Letta, I admit. But I think that his task is to build the vote of the PD up from 20-ish% towards a point where he has, if you like, a sort of leading position, rivaling 25, maybe to the 28% by the time of the election. That would be astonishing if he could achieve that, as Gianfranco's eyebrows tell us. But nevertheless, I do think that if you were him today, you would think that is my job over the next year. And of course, the final winner is Giorgia Meloni, because she is clearly the one opposition party, the one political leader who clearly stood against this, the one person who has, if you like, an open field in which to pursue the electoral campaign in 2022 and into 2023. Salvini has the dilemma of when does he pull out of the government, how much trouble does he cause, how disruptive he is. Meloni has a clean field. So those are the winners. For the Italian people are concerned, well, they're not winners, but equally they haven't learned anything that they didn't know before about the nature of Italian political parties today. I'll stop.
Thank you very much indeed, Bill, for those comments. Excellent. And let's now turn to Simona Piatoni.
Thank you, Martin. Thank you for the invitation. Yeah, I want to continue on this more positive streak because although I agree with Gianfranco that other possible and prestigious solutions were absolutely possible, including some that featured very qualified women, I think I want to see still the glass half full. With hindsight, the outcome of the presidential election of last Saturday has been, in a way, the best possible outcome, ? Since it appears to lend the Italian political system a certain stability, at least for the time being, while leaving open the election of Mario Draghi to the presidency of the Republic when and if, and this is a big if, Sergio Mattarella should decide to quit after the next general elections in the spring of 2023. He probably, given his constitutional rigor, may not announce that, but he might even do that, like Napolitano did before him. Selena underscored the weakening of the coalition and the possible brittleness that may threaten its survival until the natural elections, again, spring of 2023. But this very brittleness could also induce it not to rock the boat too much. So the executive could go on. International public opinion seemed to consider Draghi as the only credible guarantee that Italy would continue on the path of institutional reforms, relaunch of the economy, technological and green transition, and not least, reduction of its mammoth public debt. And for this reason, it almost unanimously, The Economist was an exception, wished for him to become the president of the Republic on the argument that 7 more years in the Quirinale would have been better than 14 more months in Palazzo Chigi. But although the president of the Italian Republic does not have executive powers, for example, he does not take part in EU-level negotiations of the Reformed Stability and Growth Pact, which is undergoing, is in motion right now. He does have significant powers that amount to a sort of quasi-semi-presidentialism, a word that has been used very much in the debate, as he can refuse to sign into force laws on unconstitutionality grounds. He gives the exploratory task of forming new governments to prospective prime ministers, suggests or rejects ministerial nominees of a newly forming government, and presides over the Constitutional Court, in addition to being formally the chief of the armed forces. So there was some plausibility to the argument that Mario Draghi, as president of the Republic, would have given continuity, and that was a good solution. But Mattarella is equally good, as we said. The international understanding favoring Draghi was that he would have done all that he could to secure continuity to his own current governmental action. If he had stepped down as prime minister, the heterogeneous majority, this sort of gross coalition that we have, that supports the government right now, would dissolve, and no one else would have sufficient standing to replace him. Hence, a very impropitious new governmental coalition that could have taken months to be formed. But as I said, I don't think this is very likely. Again, many commentators remarked on that the conservative result that we got reveals the fractiousness of the Italian party system, driven by deep rifts, both within the center-right and the center-left coalitions, as well as within each party, and Selena and Bill talked about it, and the general inadequacy of the Italian political class. But the question may well be that of an amateurish political class seeking popularity and media attention more than the good of the nation. But to me, it reveals three main issues, and I conclude on these three. First, there is much confusion, both among politicians and in the populace, on what political representation really means and what secures political representativeness. The issue of representation pops up again and again in Italian debate. Sometimes scant representativeness is blamed on the detachment of the political class from the real problems of the average Italians, hence populist claims. Sometimes it is attributed to the electoral law, which is currently a quite complicated system, a mixed system with a majority premium, with a closed list in the proportional side. Sometimes it is even argued that it would have marred the relationship between the extant government and the new president of the Republic, had a new one been elected, because this government was very much wanted by the current president, while the two institutional figures must be understood, according to the Constitution, as completely independent of one another, so much so that the electoral terms of the two institutions are staggered, precisely to avoid coincidence of the terms. So scant representativeness is a malaise of our time that affects many Western democracies and has many roots. Curtailed national sovereignty in a globalized and interconnected economic system, a certain social liquidity and increased economic disparities between the few and the many that makes the construction of large societal blocks quite difficult, a certain dearth of ideologists that promise to interpret the current predicament and the vision and future in which a future which appears to be just and sustainable. So in the case of Italy, it would appear that both the past system, the historical system of the First Republic of proportional representation, and the various attempts to build a bipolar, if needed, if not a bi-party system, through various mixed and spurious systems in the Second Republic have failed. But the discussion on the electoral system remains crucial, as it can perhaps induce voters and candidates to attempt a rapprochement on more down-to-earth, local, but as always local issues are, universal questions at the district level. So personally, I favor a French type majority system. The second issue is, yes, to consider again the large question of institutional reforms, apart from the electoral law just mentioned, parliamentary rules that discourage party switching and the creation of a bloated mixed group, a new reform of the parliament. I was personally in favor of a reformed parliament with a Senate representative of the regions that have proved so important in the management of the COVID pandemic. And of course, the long run and thorny issues of the relationship between the political class and the magistracy, not to mention the reform of the public administration. These are all work sites that need to be forcefully tended to, and allow me to run a famous quip in reverse. Once we made Italians, we have to make Italy, at least Italian institutions. And the third issue has to do with the retrieval, allow me to say, of a certain courage in arguing in favor of different recipes, economic recipes, sanitary recipes, foreign policy recipes, even something that Draghi has proved to be able to do without fear of being in an uneasy minority. And but also, of course, the courage to firmly stand by joint commitments, particularly at EU level when appropriate. The discussion of the Stability and Growth Pact must not block out any position and allow for real reflexive learning. And I think that Draghi will be able to do that. Thank you.
Thank you, Simona. That's that's an ambitious program of reform for Draghi. All by the national elections in 2023 as well. Thanks very much. And over now finally to Sylvia for your comments. Sylvia, thank you.
Yes, thank you. And thanks for having me. So I largely agree with what was said so far. One thing I would like to add and start off with is that I personally believe Draghi made a big mistake when at the end of last year at the press conference before Christmas, he hinted that he really wanted to become president. And his arguments were that his national unity government's job was done and anyone else could have continued the work and could have terminated the parliamentary term up until 2023, because that was clearly not the case. And I think it's always been obvious that no one else aside from Draghi could have kept together this very fragile and very heterogeneous national unity coalition. So in a way, because of the reasons we've heard, this is the best possible solution, because essentially it leaves the situation unchanged, which in the current environment is actually a good thing. However, it wasn't supposed to end this way. Professor Pasquino explained why it wasn't supposed to end this way. And I think it's very telling that it ends this way for the second time in a row, because Napolitano was Mattarellas' predecessor. So this is the second time in a row it's happening. At the time of Napolitano, we were at the height of the debt crisis. The situation is quite different now. And we can't really motivate this choice with the pandemic and external factors. I think politicians will have to take responsibility. Anyway, with recovery funds pouring in from Brussels and a thick reform agenda, as we've heard, I think having Draghi as prime minister and Mattarella as president offers stability to a country that isn't very much used to stability. And of course, it's not going to all be smooth sailing. I think this past week really showed us how fractured Italian politics is. And I think it's not just a matter of the national unity government, but it's also, we've also seen problems within the coalitions. So the center-left coalition and the center-right coalition, and within the individual parties that make up these coalitions. So it's political mayhem. And of course, it won't be easy to pass reforms because obviously the parties are not only fighting each other, but they're also fighting within themselves. However, I agree with those analysts who have said that in a way this outcome strengthens Draghi, and this is for two reasons. The first one being that he doesn't have to mediate his decisions anymore. His decisions are often unpopular. He's been criticized for not involving parliament or government ministers in his decisions. I think many of the reforms that were initiated or passed so far have been watered down because parties within his coalition don't see eye to eye on anything. And I think he had the presidency in mind, so he didn't really want to upset any of these parties, probably thinking that it would have made it easier for them to back him. Now, obviously, this is behind us. So I think that it gives him a free hand, especially because, and this is the second reason, it's pretty clear that the majority of lawmakers in parliament, except for Giorgia Meloni's hard right brothers of Italy, really don't want snap elections, and they will go out of their way to avoid losing their seats, their salaries, and their pensions. So I think Draghi will be able to play the resignation card every time his parties start quarreling or threaten not to pass important reforms. And we've seen that there is no other Draghi, no other potential prime minister that can carry on his job. So I think this will force party to think twice. Having said this, I'm pretty convinced that this election leaves Italian political parties in tatters. I don't think any of them are winners, and I think they haven't shown maturity over these past few days, kind of applauding themselves or cheering, and all of them trying to take responsibility and kind of merit for this outcome. I think they're all partly responsible for this outcome, which is not the best possible outcome, because obviously we would have wanted, or we would have deserved a new president, because that's what the Constitution says, and we're back to square one after a week of political infighting while the rest of the world was watching and many other important things were happening around us. And I believe the worst part of the whole story is actually the process, because none of them had done their homework. They knew this election was coming up for 7 years. It had been in their agenda for the past 7 years. They were divided. They knew Draghi wanted to become president. He had made it very clear around Christmas time. They didn't start negotiating over the holiday. They left it to the last minute. Berlusconi, by candidating himself, essentially blocked his own coalition from negotiating any other name with the center-left coalition. The center-left coalition itself was divided because the five-star and Conte did not want Draghi to become prime minister. Foreign Minister Luigi Di Maio, who is part of the five-star like Giuseppe Conte, instead was willing to back Draghi. At the same time, even within the Democratic Party, Enrico Letta was going to back Draghi, but cabinet ministers of the Democratic Party within the coalition, like Franceschini, Dario Franceschini, did not want to back Draghi and did not really agree with Letta. So the whole process was very confusing. They left the negotiation to the last minute. They turned in blank ballots for days. Then they publicly named potential candidates without knowing if their political partners and the rest of the coalition was going to back those. And so they ended up just kind of, eliminating potential candidates until, we ended up with what we saw on Saturday. So I think it was depressing to watch, and I think Italian voters will remember this when they head into the polls next year. So while I think it is going to be smooth sailing for the next year because it's in everyone's interest, including political parties, I think it will be very complicated once we come up to 2023 and we know that Draghi can't stay on forever and elections are finally going to happen. And I think Italian voters will give strong signals to political parties of what they think they should do, and also what they think, or if they're going to judge whether they've done a good job or not. And I'm afraid that it's not going to look pretty next year.
Thank you very much, Sylvia. Absolutely fascinating. Thank you to all of our speakers. And we've got just over half an hour for questions, and we're going to go straight to the audience now. But first, Eric is going to tell us how this is going to work. Over to you, Eric.
Well, we do have the ability to receive questions both on Zoom. For those of you in our Zoom audience, please put your questions into the Q&A box that you'll find at the bottom of your screen. And we can receive questions from the live stream on YouTube. So please do write in your questions. While you're thinking of those questions, I have two questions I'm going to pitch over to Martin to hand off to our colleagues. One is really about the timing that Sylvia introduced. Do we think that the stability of this coalition evaporates only in the window running up to the March 2023 elections, or could it fracture sooner, particularly once the pensions have been locked in September and the real negotiations over the budget for 2023 begin? And the second question is, what is the factor that's going to develop around electoral system reform, right? I mean, they apparently are talking about reforming the electoral system, but is there any real consensus on how to do that and what it will mean for the way future governments will look?
Thank you, Eric. Your first question was exactly a question I wanted to ask as well, which was, my experience with Italian elections, really instability starts kicking in roughly a year before. And so a lot of this talk about renewed stability, seriously wonder how long it will last. But let's take that up then. Anyone would like to start on the question of stability and sooner? Selena, do you want to have a go?
Yeah, as I mentioned before, I think that it's really difficult for this ruling coalition to stay together. So we will see if Draghi will be able really to maintain this ruling coalition. I think that especially Salvini will start to campaign soon. So this is the big problem. And in this case, a snap election is possible in any moment, I think. So the position of Draghi, as I said before, seems strong, but in reality is not so strong, because the problem is that, of course, he needs also the support of Salvini and of Five-Star Movement or Conte or I don't know, Di Maio, when they will understand who is the leader of that party. It basically needs this kind of parliamentary support to achieve any goal. So this is the what I think. And for the electoral system,
well, I tell you what, Selena, I'm going to turn to Gianfranco to answer that one. I'm not sure there's anyone more appropriate than Gianfranco to answer that one. Electoral reform, Gianfranco.
No, I mean, Martin, you do not want me to speak about the electoral system. I mean, it is a very, very boring subject. But I want to make one point which has to be stressed and put in very, very clearly, that the best electoral law we had after 1992 is the law signed by Mattarella, okay? Because it was the product of a popular electoral referendum, then written by Mattarella, one can say, particularly the law for the House of Deputies. But the law for the Senate was the direct product of the electoral referendum. All the other laws have been manipulations by the politicians, as we have seen manipulations that have most of the time backfired. Okay? Let me say one thing which goes against the current opinions, and is that the parties will remain quiet now, because if they've learned something, is that they can make serious mistakes. So the best thing for them to do is to remain quiet, to wait and see if the other parties make mistakes. I mean, Salvini has practically destroyed himself. through a series of mistakes. Berlusconi has made several mistakes. The only one, and I agree with Bill Emmott, that has not made mistake is Giorgia Meloni. I think that Nordio was not a good candidate, but the choice of the first candidate, I don't remember the name now, was a good choice. In any case, she has proved that the party can double the number of seats whenever time comes. Okay, but I would expect that. I think the English word is joking. A lot of joking between now and the end of the year. Then the game will be played seriously when the budget law will have to be approved. But there is no alternative. We know it. And if the president of the republic is the man I know, he is definitely not willing to dissolve parliament before March 2023.
Thanks, Gianfranco. Yes, that's jockeying for position.
Jockeying.
Yeah, exactly. Yes. Simona, do you largely agree with this on the stability, instability front?
Particularly on the electoral system. Yeah, I agree with Gianfranco that the Mattarellum was probably, the best law we had recently. Now, before this presidential election, formally, both the Lega and Fratelli d'Italia were in favor of a majoritarian system because they thought that a center right they would have won. Now they're not so sure because they are, they broke up a little bit the coalition. Certainly Forza Italia is in favor of a proportional system because otherwise it might disappear. So is Italia Viva. So in many ways, it seems that proportional representation seems to be the path of least resistance, probably the solution towards which a lot of parties may want to go. These would preside over perhaps a reconstitution of the center. It would allow the Movimento 5 Stelle to, break up but still be present. So, will we go back to proportional representation? This will certainly not, I don't think it would necessarily improve representativeness. It depends, much depends on how it's, the details, the devil lies in the details. But also certainly governability, which was the other big word that we've been looking for so many decades, would be also, very much in danger. True that the other solutions we've experienced after the Mattarellum have not delivered governability. So we'll have to see. Probably things will remain just as they are, unfortunately.
Thanks, Simona. Thank you. Bill, do you want to add something on the stability, instability?
I'd only add, first, I find it very hard to imagine that the political parties could agree on any reform of the electoral law in these circumstances. Actually, it's quite hard to imagine in any circumstances, but let's focus on these circumstances of 2022. I think it's very unlikely. So I think we should expect the next election to be run under the current electoral law. And then the result of that is that we have a new parliament. So anything is done by whatever there is the new parliament, and that includes the election of a next president of the republic if President Mattarella should decide to step down early. And I don't see why we should expect that now. I think he's most likely to stay 7 years. Because I think at least that should be the working assumption. He's only 80 years old. He's a youngster compared with Giorgio Napolitano. So I think his duty probably will prevail if he stays. So we should assume that. Other point I'd make is I, of course, agree with Gianfranco that those who have made severe mistakes would be best advised to stay quiet. However, I don't think experience suggests that having made several political mistakes, political leaders do not then go on to make more mistakes. So I would be more agnostic about how quiet it's actually going to be. I think that Salvini is, in particular, the questions are surround Lega, and I do think we're going to see some period of some potential as it were, kind of challenge between Lega's threat to quit the coalition and, as Silvia says, Draghi's ever-present, maybe unexpressed threat to resign. And you will see a sort of tension between these two possibilities. Because one of the peculiar thing that maybe none of us have mentioned about this whole presidential election is that if Draghi was the central potential candidate, then the complexity of it was the need to agree on two things simultaneously. One, him for the presidency. Two, how he should be replaced in Palazzo Chigi. And that is what the political parties proved unable or unwilling to do, hindered by other factors like the Berlusconi candidature, it's true, but also basically perhaps that was too much to expect. If you had been able to separate them, then conceivably, I do think that a new government could be formed or could have been formed for all the reasons that has been said about deputies not wishing to give up their pensions, not wanting to have early elections, and so on. Then why shouldn't there have been a Cartabia government, a Franco government, or somebody else could form a new coalition? But to agree these things simultaneously proved impossible. And that's what we've just seen, that like economic policy should only target one objective with one tool. So to target two objectives with one tool, this election proved impossible.
Thank you, Bill. Thanks. And Sylvia, do you want to add anything finally on this issue?
I think I disagree with Bill, because I think the general sense here is that politicians are having a very hard time accepting Draghi as a technocrat that has somehow silenced their political stances and everything that goes with politics. I was in Rome during the presidential election, and walking into the parliament, I really got the sense that many lawmakers really disliked Draghi on a personal level. And I think this is because he probably never made the effort to build a relationship with lawmakers. And it's been a one-man show, I think, over the past year, which is something that clearly in a parliamentary system doesn't work very well and shouldn't work. I mean, that's not the way it's supposed to work. And I think parties have had a hard time accepting that they've had to call in the technocrat last year during the pandemic when the Conte government collapsed, because they were not able to find an alternative solution at the time. And I think for them now to vote Draghi as president and then accept another technocrat as prime minister like Cartabia or as Franco would have been extremely difficult. I mean, it would have been extremely difficult to explain to their voters next year that, you know, there were 4 governments in 4 years and 2 were led by technocrats, and the first 2 were led by a lawyer who was never elected by anybody and who ruled with a Eurosceptic coalition first and then a progressive coalition afterwards. I mean, I think it's very complicated to explain to their voter bases. And maybe, you know, the pro-European progressive parties could have somehow explained it. And, you know, they would have focused on explaining it with the recovery fund and the reforms and all those things that someone like Cartabia or the finance minister Franco could have somehow guaranteed with Draghi in the presidency. But let's think about Lega or the populist 5-star. It would have been very hard for them to explain to their voters that they accepted Cartabia as a prime minister since she passed a justice reform that was not very popular amongst the 5-stars, or Daniele Franco, who was a technocrat that when the 5-star ruled in the Eurosceptic coalition with the League, they tried to get rid of at the Treasury. You know, I think it's very complicated, and maybe from outside we tend to think that technocrats make things work well in Italy because Italian politics is so messy. But then you always have to remember it's a parliamentary democracy, and you have voters who watch what happens. And just like they didn't like what happened with Mario Monti in 2013, I'm not sure they would have liked another technocratic government after the Draghi government.
Thank you, Sylvia. So that's dealt with two early questions, and we're going to take another question now from the audience. Eric.
Well, I have two questions from the audience, Martin. One is from Osvaldo Croce, who asks, what is the biggest change since 1976 that explains the situation we have today? And Osvaldo asked that because he left Italy in the summer of '76, and it seemed like a completely different political environment. And the other question is from Lorenzo Cicci, and it's to what extent is the recent constitutional reform to reduce the number of parliamentarians responsible for the very particular political attitudes we see in the current parliament, and specifically their desire to hold on to their seats?
Okay, thanks, Eric. I mean, the first question is very big and open. What is the biggest change since 1976 is this in Italian politics, is it? That accounts for where we find ourselves today? And the second question is, to what extent does the reduction in the number of parliamentarians, the constitutional reform, has that been responsible for what we've witnessed in terms of political attitudes and approaches of the parties today? Would anyone like to volunteer? First speaker on these two, Gianfranco, please.
Well, the biggest change is obviously Berlusconi's decision to take the field. He has changed Italian politics forever, because he has contributed in a decisive way to destroy the traditional parties, to destroy the way they used to compete, and to produce additional changes in societies towards a mild version of populism. Okay? It is what the reduction in the number of parliamentarians has produced one consequence that cannot be avoided. That is, you have to write a different electoral law, because in any case, you cannot maintain the existing electoral law because you have to redraw the constituencies. And this will imply a series of consequences, some of them at this point unpredictable, but it is absolutely necessary to write a different electoral law. I agree that it will be very difficult for the parliamentarians to find an agreement, and the agreement can be found only if you use what I call a defensive electoral law, and proportional representation is a defensive electoral law.
Thank you, Gianfranco. Simona, do you want to add to that?
Not so much on the second question, but on the first. Let me say what may appear to be similar in the two very different historical periods. The similarity might be that energy prices are growing, inflation is beginning to really, increase, and there is a sense of crisis. Okay. Now, everything else is basically different. There was terrorism, a very internal and very profound and deep threat back then. There had been an attempt of a coup even previously. There had been an attempt to build a complete right-wing, governments. There was a asymmetric bipolarism. One part of the parliamentary spectrum could never aim to attain government. So in many ways, the situation was super complicated. Probably the only thing that was better back then was the public debt, which in the middle of the 70s was still quite low. It then started to grow big time during the 70s and then in the 80s. But so if Osvaldo Croce were to, is so surprised and he asks, what has changed, I would say almost everything, including what Gianfranco just said. So in many ways, the situation, it appears on the surface to be messy and critical today as it was in the past, but I would say we are in a better situation today than in the 70s.
Thank you, Simona. I'm going to turn to Sylvia now, because I think you may have to leave early, Sylvia, and I want to give you opportunity to make a contribution before you leave. What time are you leaving?
Actually, I think I might go now if you'll excuse me, because my kids are screaming in the background.
Okay. Well, that allows me to thank you very much indeed for attending. Did you want to make a final comment or not?
Well, I think Piattoni and Pasquino are better placed on this specific question, so I don't want to step in.
Thank you very much indeed, Silvia.
Thank you so much.
Thanks. Bye-bye.
Thanks. Bye.
And turning to you, Selena.
Yeah. For me, also the concept of neutrality for the president of the republic has changed during this period, because during the so-called First Republic, neutrality means basically that the president comes from the ranks of small parties, or it can be an heterodox politician from the Christian Democratic Party. But now, during the Second Republic, I think there is another idea of neutrality, that is the technician. And this was, the first one was Ciampi, of course. And now we have the idea that Draghi also can be another neutral president. But I think this is something wrong, because I think, and I really believe, that the president should be a politician, should be someone that understands very well how parties behave and how they manage in a way the situation. Being an outsider can be an advantage in the short run, but then can be also a risk, I think. Also because the president in Italy, as was mentioned before, has many constitutional powers, but also he was able to cut out, in a way, many informal powers. And this aspect has to be mentioned. So the president is able to intervene sometimes in critical situations, for example, in government formation, but also during the policy making with the so-called moral suasion, for example. So for all these reasons, I think that to have a political background is essential, also because we are facing this party crisis. So for this reason, I think, Draghi has many valuable assets because he has many international relations. He has, of course, European relations that in this particular moment are so important for us. But in a way, there is some difficulties in managing, I don't know, the situation with the party. So I think this point should be stressed, I think.
Thank you, Selena. Rather than turning to Bill, I'm going to turn to another question. And Bill, you'll be first up with this one. Over to you, Eric, for this one.
So, Bill, the question I have is that Italy has been operating over the past 12 months under unusually favorable conditions in a wider European context. The money's come on stream for Next Generation EU, interest rates have been at historic lows, and everything seems to be gathering momentum. Unfortunately, as we head into 2022, the inflation rate is picking up. The debate about fiscal consolidation is starting all over again. And at some point, we're going to have to face a monetary tightening. So to what extent do you think that the favorable European context is going to have an impact on the conversation?
Over to you, Bill. That's an ideal one.
Yes, I think it's, I was trying to think about it and buy time for a moment while that's a very interesting question. I think, number one is that in some ways it's been a unfavorable circumstance in which we've been dominated by COVID and pandemic. But that has in some ways had a neutralizing effect politically. I mean, in the words, between countries over time, and also between political parties. The pandemic has, as it were, leveled a sort of playing field temporarily, and perhaps allowed for some more tolerance of exceptional measures and exceptional policies. Secondly, I do think that there's a problem with interest rates going up for Italy, in that the borrowing costs are going to rise, the impact on the debt service costs will be felt eventually. It will take time. It takes time before that to feed through. It's not just a consequence of central bank interest rates going up, but it's there in the markets. But that specter will be there and will act as something of a problem. On the other hand, you've got a new government in Germany, which appears favorable to the sorts of rethinking of the euro area's fiscal rules that Mario Draghi and Emmanuel Macron wrote about, admittedly in very general terms, in the Financial Times a few months ago. That, as it were, the discussion is open for that reform of the fiscal rules, which would assist Italy to some degree if it can happen. I think the big question is whether the inflation or economic crisis type circumstance would become so severe as to put that in danger. And I don't think that's likely during 2022, really, as a perspective, or anyway, the future that we can foresee, which is not very far. I think my guess is that the favorable wind will continue, actually, from a point of view of European politics and European economics. I mean, what's the worst that could happen? The worst that could happen would be if Emmanuel Macron was not re-elected as president in April, and an extremist of some sort were to snatch that prize. Now, that doesn't look all that likely, with the far right in France being divided between Zemmour and Le Pen. Macron looks in quite a good position as of January the 31st, but there's still a while to go. That's probably, in some ways, the biggest shadow over that environmental circumstance for Draghi and the government now. But really, the biggest worry he's going to have is within the parliament and within Italy, I would say, rather than in the external environment.
Thank you very much, Bill. Absolutely fascinating. Can I bring that European broad perspective and bring it back home again with the following question? I'm going to abuse my position as chair in doing this. When an important election takes place of this sort, it puts the country, Italy, on the stage, on the international stage. And there's a lot to be gained in terms of prestige and maybe understanding about a country from an election that takes place such as this. In that context, isn't it time that Italy got rid of this absurd process by which they elect their president, which resembles more a sort of election of a pope than it does of a head of state, where we have political parties? Doesn't it demonstrate to the world that actually all the typecast expressions that are used for Italy, partiocracy, partitocrazia, the dominance of political parties is still prevalent? You know, what looking at it from an international perspective, I'm wondering what people make of the fact that it takes 8 ballots to elect the current incumbent. I've been looking at institutional reform in Italy over the last, 30 years. And although there's been a big debate about the presidency and changing the system, maybe to a semi-presidential system or whatever, I don't recall there being much focus actually on the idea of maintaining a parliamentary democracy, but possibly just changing the way in which the president is elected to something perhaps a little more conventional. Gianfranco, do you want to start us on that one?
See, Martin, there is only one other country in Europe where you elect a president in a parliamentary democracy without giving him executive powers, and that is Austria. The last time in Austria they had an election, they had another election a few months afterwards, because the first one was not, and I say, was not only devoid of some inconvenience, I will put it this way. But in this country, if you elect the president and you do not allow him to use all his powers or her powers, then it would cause a series of criticisms of negative reactions. No, it cannot be done. That is, what can be done is to change the republic towards a semi-presidential republic, as in France. I've been advocating that since, I believe, probably the late 70s. And Giuliano Amato too, incidentally, a very good candidate to become a president of the republic, someone who has, let's say, technocratic knowledge and political experience. So there was the possibility of having a different president. We lost, I will put it this way, we lost. And Giorgia Meloni wants to elect a president. She doesn't know the difference between US presidential republic and semi-presidentialism French style. So you cannot discuss with Giorgia Meloni about that. Let me conclude by telling you that there was a very easy solution to all this kind of problem. It is Mario Draghi elected president of the republic, and the first thing he would have done would be to appoint Sergio Mattarella prime minister.
Yeah. Thank you, Gianfranco. Simona, do you want to add anything to that?
On changing the rules for electing the president. Well, unfortunately, as Gianfranco just said, the other system that people think about is direct election by the people, right? Popular election. And that I think would be quite dangerous, because then really popular candidates, for example, Berlusconi, would be elected quite rapidly. I think a certain filter, a certain, filter of the system is opportune, because the president needs to give stability, is a guardian of the constitution. It embodies a wide and understanding of what the nation is, and not just one side. So I think it's a complicated Byzantine, perhaps you would think, Martin, system right now, but it can be improved. But yes, parties are still the main actors, but also the representatives from the regions do have play a role. And I would think that in a reformed parliament, where the Senate were really a federal chamber, that could be financed in a way that does not give the popular vote such a strong say in the election of the president, and at the same time, however, gets the voice of the people in different forms of aggregation, as through parties, but also at the territorial level. I think that would be a very good reform. I don't know. No, Gianfranco is frowning, so perhaps it's not such a good idea.
Thanks. We're heading towards the end, so I'm going to give Selena and then Bill a chance to make their comment on this question. Selena.
I think that only direct election for the president without widening powers is useless, basically. There is no point in this sort of institutional change. But I think that is really unlikely that parties could agree on this kind of institutional reform. I don't know if they can agree on the electoral reform. So can you imagine on the institutional reform? I think it's really unlikely. Another point is the electoral system to select the president. Basically, it's true, it is really complicated, but of course, the meaning is trying to obtain the largest the largest majority possible, taking into account all party voices, basically. And if you think, for example, to another democracy, that is Germany, when they start talking about the coalition government and they try to organize an agreement, that it takes a lot of time. So I think that in certain cases, in all the parliamentary democracy, there are certain mechanisms that probably involve more time than in other systems where there is other rules, of course. So I don't think that is something peculiar of the Italian system. Every system has some complicated institutional feature sometimes. So I don't think this is the problem. The problem are the political conditions, I think, not the rules. This is my opinion.
Thank you, Selena. And finally to you, Bill, on this issue.
Well, I suppose
as a non-Italian, do you want to see it reformed?
Well, I'd say, first of all, as an Englishman, I have to accept that the way the head of state is chosen in the United Kingdom, which is by looking at a birth certificate, perhaps isn't the best starting point for this discussion. We look at the birth certificate and then we make sure that the head of state has no power at all, allowing our prime minister to do what on earth he likes. So let's not recommend the British system. I think you'd agree, Martin. But second, I'd say from an international point of view, the process that Italy went through last week did not look so bad. Number one, it had a kind of exoticism to it, which is, of course, what foreign observers of Italy like. People having mysterious discussions in rooms, people putting forward blank ballots and so forth. To have a choice rather like the papal choice kind of fits a certain image abroad of Italy and Italian politics in any case. But finally, I'd say more seriously that actually the question is one for the Italian people. This system may seem not the one you would design if you had a blank sheet of paper, but it hasn't produced very bad outcomes. In fact, it's produced quite good outcomes in many ways in a series of pretty good presidents in recent decades, perhaps from Mr. Leone, since the disaster of Mr. Leone, and since then, maybe there've been, it's been only one way to get better. The things could get better. And so if I was trying to look for institutional reforms in Italy, I wouldn't start with the President of the Republic. I think there are a lot of other things, as my far more expert co-panelists have identified. So I wouldn't worry too much about this system.
Thank you very much, Bill. And that brings us to an end. We've run slightly over. Before I hand back to Eric, just to formally close, I wanted to thank all our panelists, Selena, Simona, Gianfranco, Bill, and of course, Sylvia, for an absolutely fascinating discussion. It's been a real honor and pleasure for me to chair it. So thank you very much indeed for your time. And back to you, Eric, to close.
My closing remark is obvious, Martin, which is thanks to you for hosting such a terrific event. We really enjoyed it here at the Robert Schuman Center. I hope you will all come back, not just you as panelists, but our members of the audience to participate in future conversations about Italian politics. It's an important subject, and we're very grateful for the time you've given it.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Great
Bye.
to see you.
Bye.
Bye, everyone.